Thank you so much, David. It's true that philosophers, especially epistemologists, have not been engaging enough with this topic. I hope that changes. So a lot of what I draw from is actually, I'm reading the anthropologists and I'm reading the social theorists from other domains to develop this argument. But I'm very happy that you invited me and that I can share this work on extractivist epistemology. So I'm going to share my screen now. Okay, so this paper is going to develop the concept of extractivist epistemologies as a way to reveal and reflect upon the effect of colonialism and imperialism on practices of knowing. And I'm going to argue that projects that aim to extract resources of many various types, whether material or intellectual, have generated specific knowledge practices, and these in turn have generated certain approaches in epistemology that need to be rethought. These epistemic approaches and practices are especially pursued by agents in the global north, but they have influenced normative epistemic ideals and epistemic presuppositions almost everywhere in the modern period. This paper is organized in 4 sections. First, I'm going to give a brief overview of extractivism as practice and idea. Second, I'm going to offer an initial explanation of the epistemological approaches that grew out of extractivist practices. And third, I'm going to discuss 2 case studies that reveal the concrete and specific ways in which extractivism negatively impacts knowledge practices. And then in the final section, I'm going to develop 4 corrective norms to counteract extractivist epistemologies. Situated as we still are within a world that has been formed by colonialism, both in terms of its ideas and its material relations, reforming or revising epistemology needs to follow a non-ideal approach. And this means that the alternative norms should be understood as corrective and ameliorative in relation to current injustices rather than timeless and universal. So I'm hearing some noises there. I'm gonna, just a second, I'm gonna close this window. I'm coming to you from Brooklyn, New York, and the sounds of Brooklyn are always with us. So extractivism, so capitalism continues to pursue projects that extract material resources from the formerly colonized areas of the world, and these include mineral and plant resources, as well as timber, fossil fuels, animal products that are then monetized and exchanged. And this was driven, of course, by the needs of colonial, imperial power since the conquest. Then, as now, it was cloaked by terms like progress, development, and stewardship. To be sure, the use of the general term extraction as a way to characterize transnational and colonial economic activity in general can be misleading. The era of primitive accumulation, as it was practiced in the early days of the conquest, is no longer the main or only form that extraction takes. Forms of biopiracy and bioprospecting aim not only to extract, but to patent plant material and control its production and distribution, as I'll discuss later. What's taken is not simply a product, but a process of production, and this always involves a knowledge component. Also, there's new expansions of extractivism in debt, real estate, social media, and so forth. It's important to emphasize that transnational corporate entities enrich not only foreign nationals, but also domestic elites. Poorer nations such as Ecuador, Colombia, and Bolivia that have rich mineral deposits are caught up in a competition to attract transnational mining corporations. Mining projects can bring significant employment as well as large payments, which may or may not be used for public goods. The principal leverage governments have in this competition for foreign investment is to offer control, allowing for unilateral expropriation of private property with minimal restrictions or state participation. State-run mining and coal companies, along with their associated unions, have been liquidated under pressure from the IMF in some cases. The negative effects of extractivism then may well be primarily caused by the fact that extractivism is embedded in a neo-colonial global economy. There's no egalitarian collaboration, no shared decision-making, no mandated cooperation between the interested parties, no voice for those dispossessed by extraction. So to explore the epistemic practices associated with extractivist projects, then we need to understand that we're speaking of the real world of imperialist and capitalist extractivism and not some abstract form of extraction. We should note, here, let me go to the next slide. We should note that the specific definition of the concepts of value and profit used by extractors. Under capitalism, profit is understood in a diminished commodity sense as consisting only in fungible and exchangeable value in an abstract form. Profit is not value in general, but only a very specific form of value with very specific and limited functions. Profit is defined by what the corporation gains without factoring in what others have lost. When profit is assumed to exhaust the sphere of value, prior ideas about value that a community may have are obliterated. So I'm going to use the term extractivism in this talk to mean a specific practice linked to our current world, linked to long colonial histories and embedded today in vastly unequal global economic and political forces. And it's this specific practice that's generated the set of ideas I want to examine. Oops, I went the wrong way. To name that which is extracted a resource in a potentially profit-making value is itself a substantive shift, affecting our sense of ourselves and our relationality to the world. And as the slide says, there's some very good work by my colleague, philosopher Akhil Belgrami on Gandhi's radicalism as being grounded in Gandhi's ability to formulate the following questions. How and when did we transform the concept of nature into the concept of natural resources? When and how did we transform our concept of the world as not merely a place to live in, but a place to master and control? And this third question I'm particularly interested in, how did we transform the concept of knowledges to live by into the concept of an expertise to rule by? Now I want to move to how extractivism is or gives rise to an epistemology. Extractivism as a practice conceptualizes the object of its pursuit, just as epistemology conceptualizes epistemic objects in various ways. Extractivism is ultimately motivated by the pursuit of commodifiable value and is predicated on certain metaphysical ideas about the nature of the value that it's pursuing. Nothing is sacred or outside the domain of potential extraction. So here I have two claims. First, extractivism assumes that value can be identified in an objective and universal way, such that the extractor's claims about the value of a given resource trump other parties or overturn other parties contesting these claims. Plural conceptualizations must be ranked or preferably replaced by singular ones. So if we define museum curators, as stewards who protect universal values, then the value of a Native American artifact just is what museum curators identify it to be. Archaeologists likewise are presented often as working with superior epistemic methods, such as objectivity traditionally defined, and thus their assessments outrank others. Contestations over value claims made by particular tribal groups are often labeled particularistic and subjective, neither objective nor universal, as Alison Wiley argues. They may be defined as resistance to science. Real values are objectively determined by experts. So that's the first point. The second point is that extractivism assumes that values are non-relational. The assumption that values can be transported to a new domain without being diminished assumes a non-relational, decontextualized formulation of value. In other words, values are conceptualized as discrete and independent of their relations to adjacent entities. Resources that are separated from their original context are not assumed to lose value in the process of removal. They only lose value as discrete entities if they deteriorate in some material way. Further, those values that may be destroyed in the process of extracting other values are not co-determining or co-constitutive, but merely adjacent, and do not need to be factored into the quantification of the value achieved in the extraction. The belief that the values that have been destroyed in the process of extraction can be fairly paid for in a one-time payment also assumes concepts of value determination and the possibility of transforming values into monetized elements that can then be calculated in a fair exchange. Any claim that an extracted value has been saved, protected, or utilized assumes a metaphysics of non-relationality. In some cases, a value may not diminish in the process of extraction, but diminishing values can occur when, for example, artifacts are removed from their surroundings in ways that compromise their interpretation of their meaning, or plants with medicinal properties are used away from local communal practices that may impact their efficacy. The problem is when we assume without analysis that a non-relational approach is descriptively adequate. So far, I've been discussing the metaphysical approach to value, but extractivist epistemologies operate in a similar way to assume that epistemic resources can be identified, extracted, and given a fair market value. The key feature of an extractivist epistemology is the way in which it treats this epistemic resource as separable from its origin without subsequent loss, rendering it into a commodity with exchange value over which exclusive rights can be contractually defined. So here I say, I have a list. Knowledge extraction could then be a mislabeling since knowledge is not stable across forms of epistemic practice. So knowledge extraction, that concept itself assumes that you've got this thing that you move over here and it remains the same. Extraction involves ontological revision and knowledge construction, as I just discussed. Extraction assumes pieces of knowledge are discrete and separable from their original context and relation. And I think it's also the case that extraction sort of assumes it overturns the idea that knowledge is a making and prefers the idea that knowledge is a discovery. And the concept that knowledge is a kind of a making activity rather than a discovery activity is a pretty much standard accepted idea in most social epistemology today, and a lot of epistemology today, actually post-Quinean. In the Anglo-American philosophical world, knowledge has been understood as a making relation to the world, that because it involves interpretation and judgment and choices and pragmatic considerations and a variety of possibilities that it's not a deductive operation. But when you talk about it as a making relation, then I think that processes of epistemic non-engagement with locals and the processes that don't engage in collaboration, that I'll talk about when I get to the corrective norms that I want to put forward, that really makes a difference. If we think of knowledge as a discovery kind of relation, it really makes a big difference. So extraction, the last point I put here is assumes that dialogic models of knowing are epistemically unnecessary, that extractors can by themselves perform interpretation, analysis, judgment, and application. So one of the questions that we need to consider is whether, in fact, knowledge in all cases is extractable in this way. And to get at this question, it's useful to look at the claims of indigenous groups who've argued that some of the knowledge that extractors pursue is inaccessible, untranslatable, and unknowable. This is from Gail Guthrie Velas. It's actually Velasquez. I've got it misspelled there. It's Chippewa. And as she points out, this is a challenge to the power and privilege of outsiders. And she cites Jimmy Durham, who, when asked about the meaning of a Cherokee text, replies that I don't want them to know. What I want them to know is that they can't know that. Now, there is an ambiguity in, let me go back to this. There's an ambiguity in Durham's claim about the impossibility of knowing here. Is it because the outsider's ability to know compromised because Durham and others will not allow them access to the knowledge? Or is it beyond their ability because the nature of the knowledge is such that it is lost in the process of translation or lost in the process of extraction? And we might imagine that extraction under conditions of colonialism renders outsiders truly bereft of the hermeneutic resources and motivations necessary to understand certain concepts and meanings. This is because epistemic collaborations require trust as well as a capacity to communicate. If there's no trust, this is why Durham is saying, I don't want them to know. As Brenda Dalmia has argued, successful knowing often requires attending to the qualitative relations between communities of knowers. So this is what I think I just went through this. So I want to bring up this concept of relational humility that's developed in Brenda Dalmia's book, Caring to Know, in which she's arguing for this concept as distinct from the typical understanding of the norm of epistemic humility as described by Socrates. What Socrates says famously, I know that I don't know, right? So my knowledge is that I am ignorant. This is compatible with elitism. Socratic humility, as I say further down, can be compatible with elitism because you can say, well, I know that I don't know, but the rest of you don't know that you don't know. So I'm still superior to everybody in my community, or certainly people in other communities. So relational humility is the idea that to know that is the idea that I know that the other knows or may know what I do not know, right? So it is an attribution of ignorance to myself, and it is also an attribution of knowledge to the other. So relational humility motivates epistemic practices that attend to relations between knowers, unlike Socratic humility. And I would also note here that the concern with relations between knowers that develops here is epistemically motivated, not simply morally and politically motivated. So a second corrective norm, I don't know that I want to develop here besides relational humility, is to incorporate assessments of epistemic relations as part of the justificatory procedure. Truth claims are always relative to the evidence, and part of assessing the necessary evidence is an accounting of evidence gathering, interpretation, and assessment. Did knowers seek out and consider competing evidence? Did knowers invite objections and consider the strongest objections? These are standard norms of good scientific practice, but they need to address the power differentials that exist both within and between communities of knowers before they can determine whether evidence gathering and evidence assessment was in any way rigorous. So incorporating an assessment of relations directs knowers to consider the ways in which relations between knowers, both as individuals and as groups, affect the identification and the assessment of evidence. All right, in the next section, I'm going to turn to some case studies, and then I'll return in the last section to the corrective norms that I think can be pulled out of this practice. The first one I want to discuss is biopiracy and the arguments over patents. Corporations, as we know, pursue patents over knowledge about plants, for example, with medicinal properties. This is kind of a paradigm case of extractivist approaches to knowledge that there's been a huge amount of writing about and a huge amount of legal contestations and social movements about. Patents have become viewed by many as a form of biopiracy. Though knowledge is accorded to indigenous groups, and this is relatively recent to the 20th century, you can go back to the 18th century and find ways in which the knowledge was denied. Knowledge was not accorded to indigenous groups. Even while certain knowledge was stolen, it was seen as they just happened upon this knowledge, or they didn't get the credit as doing experimentation and observation and other aspects of the scientific process. They were seen as just somehow naively having this knowledge, and then the knowledge could be taken by the Europeans and given a more rigorous sort of manifestation. So it's relatively recent that knowledge has been accorded to indigenous groups, but there's still biopiracy at stake. What's at stake here is not just the interpretive frameworks of diverse groups, but I want to suggest the epistemologies of diverse groups. So there's dramatic differences in constructions of nature, in interpretive frames of biodiversity, in the goals of resource management, and in the processes by which groups pursue knowledge. And Carrie Koskinen and Christina Rowland describe what they call scientific intellectual movements, or SIMs, as collective efforts to devise and implement structural remedies that can address a series of epistemic injustices, both hermeneutic and testimonial. SIMs are distinct from other social movements in that they have a knowledge-producing aim and not merely social and political aims. Toward achieving these aims, SIMs contest the existing normative expectations in scientific projects, and this requires putting epistemic concepts and norms of practice on the table for critique and reconstruction. So these corporations, so the case of what has come to be called biopiracy provides some examples of these points. Is a concept meant to describe the sort of activity that major transnational corporations engage in to acquire exclusive rights over various resources and processes, usually involving food and health. These corporations use international and national laws to secure access to and power over what the world's population needs to survive. Along the way, entities of global capital affect how knowledge is defined and which epistemic resources come into view. Let's see about that. With the next one, I don't want to. I want to use the example of the neem tree as the primary example here. Just a pretty picture of the tree for you. But before we get to this, I want to say that when corporations claim to know better how to understand and make use of these resources to develop them efficiently and effectively in order to achieve the largest positive impact, they're covering over the fact that they're seeking different kinds of knowledge and maybe redefining key terms. So part of the problem is that patent arguments do not allow for epistemic pluralism or multiple ways to define terms. In the context of the international courts, patent claimants must assert that the corporation has achieved an exclusive process and engaged in invention, and that the profitability of this invention should be protected so as to encourage further innovation in these critical markets. In order to be able to claim invention, claimants must pass two tests, a novelty test and an obviousness test. They must be able to claim that what they are patenting is new in some important respect and that it involves a procedure that is not obvious, such as simply scattering seeds with known pesticidal properties around arable land. So there are prior assumptions involved about how to discern what is new and obvious, and enormous profits at stake, which can skew reasoning and inhibit transparency. The criterion, so the question is how to establish what is new. Should an industrial reformulation of a traditional process be classified as new or as an extension? What counts as a straightforward application as opposed to innovative applications? And who gets to determine the relevant prior assumptions involved in defining these terms and on what basis? So all sides to the patent debates are obviously interested parties, but considering the legitimacy of claims to either newness or obviousness requires the input of the parties with the detailed knowledge of prior practices. The criterion involving obviousness is perhaps even more problematic than newness. Traditional processes are sometimes characterized under the domain of obviousness, even when they're the product of extensive experimentation across generations. Traditional approaches to farming are highly complex, involving methods of cultivating hybrids, a capacity for soil assessment, the ability to assess how various crops affect the maintenance of soil health, as well as pest control and seed regeneration, among other things, all of which involves multiple communities and generations who have shared their experience and knowledge. So questions of obviousness need to consider how what may seem to be an obvious process has been historically produced through collaborative effort. Now let's look at the case of neem. Oh, I've just got the picture. So neem is the name of a tree that flourishes in many parts of the global south. It's long been known about in South Asia. It was described in ancient Indian medicinal and religious texts, which gave detailed information about how to prepare neem and what kinds of ailments it could address. Its ancient botanical name, Azadirachta indica, actually means the free tree. It was not only made use of in the ancient world. In the 20th century, there was significant amount of research done on the neem tree by the Indian Agriculture Research Institute, as well as Khadi Village Industries Commission in India. And the central feature that began to draw attention was the neem tree's ability to provide pest control, because in the 1970s, Western companies and Japanese companies became interested in developing pesticides that were not chemical based. And so it led to a natural plant search for natural plant-based alternatives. And this initiated the patent wars over neem. Starting in 1985, multiple patents were filed for the production of synthetic forms. In this way, patent claimants tried to meet both the new and the not obvious criteria. Those opposed to the patents argued that the synthetic production was an extension of traditional processes without sufficient innovation to be classified as new. So you had the head of the National Research Council in the US, Eugene Schultz, argue that, quote, the biologically active polar chemicals could be extracted using technology already available to villages in developing countries, unquote. Opponents of patents also argued that the newness claim was relative to location and that patent offices in the West took up the name claimants' cases only because they were unfamiliar with the common knowledge of this plan in many non-Western areas of the world. The effort to resisting patenting name involved a large coalition of research and policy groups, farming collectives, and NGOs around the world, including the West. It took years of organizing with expensive legal teams to establish the fact that Western corporations had neither discovered the properties of neem nor invented the method of isolating the key causative elements of the tree. More recently, different and more promising forms of collaborations around ethnobotany are developing across differently positioned groups. As Shane Green reports, these collaborations explode the idea of discovery, as if Westerners are working in virgin territory. They also challenge some prevalent ideas about traditional knowledge as unchanging or bounded to specific communities. Relational and dialogic approaches to knowing then are developing and will have an impact on not only the knowledge gained, but on the concepts and assumptions that inform knowing practices, as well as motivating the effort to create truly egalitarian collaborations. So my next second case study involves the struggle over museum collections, which are, museums are understood as repositories of knowledge. And the people who build museums and curate museums are viewed as neutral political players. They are protective of artifacts that can be used as sources of knowledge for the world. So they are involved in the extraction of artifacts from original sites since the inception of museums, including burial grounds, and then they place these artifacts in new contexts in the museum. In the United States, 1,500 museums house several million artifacts, including hundreds of thousands of Native American human remains and funeral objects that were placed in grave sites, such as beads, pipes, feathers, special clothing, ceramics, and other artistic products. Some of these artifacts have, of course, been stolen, plundered, and looted. Some were legally purchased under varied conditions, including extortion. So the legal-illegal distinction does not really settle the moral issues. Philip Deloria explains the epistemological outcomes of such extractions as follows. He says, quote, "A collection created a vast web of possibilities for recontextualization, for moving objects out of one location and into another. The most important recontextualization may have centered on the authority of the collectors themselves, for the objects constituted them as unique figures of authority," and I would say epistemic authority. So go to the next slide. In the 1960s, a coalition of tribes initiated an effort to have what they called repatriation. And by 1990, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act was passed after decades of social movement activism. It only applies to the United States, but it mandates that Native groups have the right to reclaim the remains of the dead if they can be proven members of their tribe. So it involves a knowledge project of trying to prove this, right? What the NAGPRA does, though, is it gives only museum officials the right to judge claims about the identity of remains. So a tribe has to go to the museum officials, make their case that a particular person or a set of bones that's in the museum is a member of their tribe, and then that claim is adjudicated only by museum officials. So there's no real epistemic collaboration in assessing validity, given that the museums officials make the final determination. However, since NAGPRA passed, tens of thousands of human remains have been returned, but more than 100,000 continue to be housed in museums, including in the Brooklyn Museum right over here, not far from where I live. So this is an ongoing struggle. European museums have no national laws requiring repatriations of any sort and have almost entirely refused to accede to demands from either nations or ethnic groups. In the US, there's now efforts to strengthen the terms of NAGPRA, improve elements of the process to make it more collaborative, and extend its reach. So Native groups are now demanding, for example, the return of unaffiliated remains that cannot be identified as having a relation to a specific tribe, asking that these still be removed from museum display cases, even though they're not covered under NAGPRA. There's also contestation over what counts as living beings. Who determines the meaning of living? Some groups argue that artisanal or produced objects, such as the Ahayuda, which are wooden objects taken to be war gods or keepers of the sky, and that have long been traded as commodities among non-native peoples, that these have spiritual elements and deserve to be included in repatriation laws, despite the fact that tribal practices will then place these objects outside and allow them to deteriorate over time. So the struggle is over ontological assumptions about how to conceptualize objects, as well as how to prioritize diverse conceptions of value. Marisol de la Cadena recounts an interesting collaborative event between highly knowledgeable parties that demonstrates epistemic failure between museum officials and tribal groups. And the event involved an invitation to Quechua leader Nazario Turpo, who was asked to be a consultant for an exhibition planned by the United States National Museum of the American Indian. The work of translation in this collaboration was enormous, and as she shows, it predictably failed, but in a way that museum officials seemed unaware. And I won't go through the whole example here for reasons of time, but it's quite an interesting example. And she describes this incident as one in a long series of mistranslations following Eduardo Viveros de Castro's concept of equivocations. An equivocation in de Castro's view is not an error, nor is it a failure, but it is a communicative disjuncture in which interlocutors are not talking about the same thing. So equivocations are constitutive features of cultural translation, so they're unavoidable. But this also means that they are incorrectly understood as failures. And I think there's a lot of epistemic assumptions involved in that identification of them as failures. Attempting to overcome them is the wrong goal, Viveros de Castro argues. Colonial ventures used to use force to destroy languages in a vain attempt to produce singular, unified meanings. Epistemic collaborations are hobbled by such methods, not enhanced. A dialogic collaboration across cultures cannot be effective if it seeks to purge all differences in the pursuit of complete univocality. Instead, there needs to be a steady awareness of divergences within communicative practices. Productive and positive relations between speakers do not require perfect translatability, and in fact, the attempt to purge differences will likely diminish relations, erode trust, and thus actually eclipse the quality of understanding that is genuinely possible. If either party were to cease communication when equivocations occur, this could only be because commonality and similarity are assumed necessary for communication, but this motivates silencing and the downplaying of differences. So let me skip to go to the last section here, where I'm arguing for these 4 corrective norms. The first one involves this concept that Boaventura de Souza Santos writes about, which is a principle of the incompleteness of all knowledge on the grounds that the development of existing sciences and technologies is historically contingent and affected by contextual conditions. He writes, quote, "There is no essential or definitive way of describing, ordering, and classifying processes, entities, and relationships in the world." And this claim of incompleteness is familiar in 20th century traditions of the philosophy of science, especially the historicist trend developed by Imre Lakatos, Thomas Kuhn, Hilary Putnam, Paul Feyerabend, and others. As Putnam argues, the impressive success of the sciences in functional outcomes and prediction is compatible with their fallibilism and the partiality of their ontological picture of the world, based as these are on contingent conceptual repertoires that will no doubt be replaced or modified. Hence, incompleteness does not challenge all versions of scientific realism, because any given ontological picture of the world may be partially correct. But acknowledging such partiality as an inevitable feature of knowing systems motivates engagement with other forms of science and other epistemologies. Secondly, what follows from the acknowledgement of incompleteness is the need for the goal, as I say here, of inter-epistemology, or developing functional relationships across divergent epistemologies. If we accept as inevitable that a plurality of epistemologies will continue to exist, and that epistemologies and ontologies will always be partial and incomplete, then we need to think through the terms by which we can develop these productive relationships. Accepting a diverse set of epistemologies need not be a relativism that would accommodate all epistemic approaches. For example, we might want to critique certain Western epistemic ideas and practices that assume the 0-point hubris, as Santiago Castro Gomez calls it, the absolute objectivity, the absolute universality, the absolute completeness of the Western epistemic apparatus of practices and norms. That because that kind of conception of mastery does not play well with others. It blocks the possibility of dialogic, collaborative approaches across divergences of ontologies and epistemologies. So inter-epistemology doesn't necessarily mandate an acceptance and a happy pluralism that includes everybody. But because the goal of inter-epistemology is to have functional relationships. So you can look at practices and ideas and epistemologies that block the possibility of that as a problem. Let me move on here. So the idea of inter-epistemology may look too chaotic to produce functional working relationships. And the concern may be that multiple research communities can only cooperate, some people might think, if all of the participants share methodological approaches and standards. And I just want to take a minute to say why this is not the case. This requirement inhibits collaboration before it's begun. To see why this isn't necessary, we need to understand that methodological standards are not objective, but conventional in character and irreducibly social, to quote Sean Wilholt here. Research projects are guided by specific aims, such as whether to value positive results over negative results or vice versa. These may work at cross purposes, so both cannot be valued equally. Rapid HIV tests confer highly reliable negative results, but also highly unreliable positive results. Methodological choices are thus guided by priorities of utility, as well as decisions about resource allocation. We might achieve high positive results from a process that identifies oak trees only when they're carrying acorns, but this is a method that has limited practical utility. So I think from this example, and I'm just going to end with this example in just a minute. The epistemic advantage of collaboration, though, across diverse communities becomes clearer when standards and methods come out from behind the cloak of traditional objectivity and disinterestedness. Debates then must include a recognition of what are the diverse goals and interests that can shift assessments of practices. It then can become clear why collaborations need not pursue consensus on research methods. In fact, dissensus about priorities and values may enlarge the overall understanding of the phenomena, such as when human remains are viewed divergently as a source of cultural knowledge that overrides all other considerations, or entities with intrinsic moral value that require respect and deference, or potentially dangerous forces. Each of these counsel different methods of engagement with human remains. Collaboration does not require that only one understanding win out. In some cases, there may be ways to accommodate more than one goal and more than one method of engagement. Thus, if diversity in understanding human remains is viewed as an inevitable impediment to knowledge, epistemic outcomes will be unnecessarily foreshortened. So the third and fourth norms I've already talked about pretty much, so I don't want to, I don't think I need to go through the idea, but it's developing relational humility as an epistemic value and regularizing the assessment of epistemic relationships and knowing practices. And this is to argue again that productive knowledge outcomes requires attending to the qualities of relationships between the relevant parties to a knowledge project. So shifting to the concept of interepistemology and away from universalist epistemology, pursuing the capacity for relational humility, regularizing the assessment of epistemic relationships, all of these things contribute to the development of interepistemology or developing functional relationships across divergent epistemologies. So I'll stop there and welcome your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Linda.
Thank you so much.
And I'll pass it to David, so that David coordinates the debates.
Okay, great. So if you have questions, just put your hand up, and otherwise you can also put it in the chat, of course. Thank you so much for the talk. I think there's a lot in it that relates to debates that we already had in the conversation.